Okay, welcome back everyone. Delighted to welcome you to this expert panel, and it's a great delight for me to hand over to the chair of this session, Dr. Rachael Davies from Queen Margaret University. Rachael.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our session, No Mind Left Behind in Education, with our expert panel. So our focus today is thinking about how neurodiversity is shaping education. So as I was kind of introduced, my name is Rachael Davies, and I will be the chair today. So I'm going to ask each of the participants to introduce themselves, then we're going to spend about 20 minutes on some questions that I have prepared, and then we're going to ask the audience if they have any questions. If you could please use the app, that would be great. And Sarah is also running around, so if you can put your hand up, and she can help you with the app if you have any issues. So if you're happy to just introduce yourselves.
Hi, okay, cool. Sorry, I was like, is there a microphone? It's right there, evidently. I'm Dr. Elliott Spaeth, and until recently I was a lecturer, and now I am a consultant in working with lecturers and other people in higher education to help them make decisions about learning and teaching in particular, to help them do that in a way that doesn't prioritize the needs of non-disabled, neuronormative ways above disabled and neurodivergent and other ways of being. Sorry, clearly I did not prepare this specific part well enough. And I am autistic, ADHD, OCD, physically disabled in a few ways, and trans, and my pronouns are he, him.
I'm Fergus Murray. I'm a science teacher. I teach chemistry and physics at 2 schools in Edinburgh. And I'm co-founder and chair of AMASE, the Autistic Mutual Aid Society, Edinburgh. I'm autistic, and I've been on a waiting list for an ADHD assessment for about 3 years now.
How was that waiting, given that you might have ADHD? Was it fun?
Just the thing.
Thought so, yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
I'm Pete Wharmby. I'm an autistic author, I suppose, technically. And I'm autistic, and again, I'm on a waiting list for an ADHD diagnosis for, I think, 2.5 years. So I've got another probably 5 years to wait there. I'm an ex-teacher, used to teach English, and these days I just tend to do online tutoring, which is much easier because classrooms are horrible, stressful places to be in.
Great, thank you very much. So just to say, keep your questions coming through. I am keeping an eye on them, so as we're talking, if anything pops up, please just do let me know. So, question 1, we're going to start with Elliott. So what do you think the role of neurodivergent educators should be for students and the educational systems that they work in? Big question to start with.
The problem is that I have ideological issues with the concept of the word should, but
okay.
That being said, that's not a criticism, it's just that causes like a glitch in my brain. So I'm going to instead answer the question, like, what can the role be? Because the should suggests like that people should always choose that, even if they don't have the emotional, physical, whatever resource. But what it can be, I think, is partly modeling, and people talk about that a lot in relation to that you could also be a lecturer or a teacher. But for me, it's more than that. It's the idea that it's actually okay to be themselves. And though many people might have said before, oh, well, you'll never get anywhere if you exhibit X behavior or have X diagnosis. For me, it's important to try and, for myself, because I choose to, be authentically myself as an idea to show people, look, it's not true that you inherently can't do X and Y. It's that the system might be suggesting that they would prefer you behave this way. And then for the educational systems, I think it's about, given the power of being in the position of an educator compared to being, say, a student, it's about helping communicate to people that might not understand that the needs that neurodivergent people have are legitimate, and that they shouldn't try and like be the gatekeepers of whether or not they are.
Yeah, I appreciate you pulling out the should versus can thing, because yeah, it's not always easy to be out as neurodivergent in school situations. I like to try and make sure that my autistic students know that I'm autistic, because I think it can count for a lot to see someone doing sort of okay in adult life, at least as far as they can tell, who shares a cognitive style with them. But I teach chemistry and physics, and really neurodiversity doesn't come up that much in the classroom. But when it does, I try and make it clear that I am autistic, and that shapes a lot about who I am and how I teach science. So yeah, there's that aspect of it, which I wouldn't want every neurodivergent teacher to feel like they have to do that. In terms of systems and changing things, yeah, I mean, being openly autistic on staff, I think can't help but change the way that some of your colleagues are going to think about neurodivergence. I think that actually can count for a lot. For my part, I've also tried to engage with political processes around neurodiversity in education, and particularly autism in teacher education and so on, which has been an exhausting and intermittently rewarding process. I think things are getting better. I've run training for quite a lot of my colleagues, and I think there is a unique role for neurodivergent teachers in this kind of thing, or for at least people who have experience being neurodivergent teachers. Obviously, a lot of us leave the profession, and that's important too.
I guess that's where I come in. Yeah, I think that there is an awful lot of pressure if you're a neurodivergent teacher who is in any way wanting to improve things. That you're going to feel pressure to do something in school, and as Elliott and Fergus have said, that often you might not have the physical or emotional wherewithal to actually manage to do that, but the pressure still remains. And if you are openly neurodivergent, and if the senior team, for example, know that you are, then there may well be an external pressure there too. You may be asked to lead things or provide training or whatever it might be. And I think that pressure can be quite exhausting. But I think that when it's off your own back, and when it's something of your own choosing, so for example opening up in the classroom, being openly autistic in front of your students, then there can be a real culture change there. I mean, I experienced that many times with year 11 groups that stick in my mind just before I stopped teaching, where I was very openly talking about being autistic, and the autistic students in that class, I think they appreciated that, and they started talking about their experiences, and all of the neurotypical students, or we assume they were neurotypical, I suppose, were fascinated in a very pleasant way. And these were boys. I was given an all boys lower set of students who could be a bit of an interesting group, but they were fascinated, and they took it really well, and they ended up being very cool with the whole thing, and I always see that as a kind of microcosm of what's possible if we are open and if we talk, as long as we're comfortable too, because I think that students in particular are very open and willing to adapt their frame of references to encompass neurodivergency once they know what it is, and once they've actually seen what it is and they understand it, and they're okay with it. In terms of systems are hard to change. I feel like if neurodivergent teachers are able to just prod senior team or policymakers in the right direction, towards listening to other neurodivergent teachers or neurodivergent people, not necessarily the teacher themselves, who might not have the, capacity to do that, but to go elsewhere, to look elsewhere, and get speakers in, get people in, get autistic voices heard, then that can make a big difference. But it is the pressure of wanting to change the entire system is even bigger than wanting to change, just your one school. So I think, it's something that we probably do better collaboratively as a whole, rather than, individually stuck in our classrooms, I suppose.
Thank you. I think you've probably touched on this kind of second question a little bit, but You know, we know educators often feel overwhelmed by the idea of identifying or providing supports for neurodivergent children. And so I suppose I'm asking, how can we empower teachers to make a positive difference? I'm going to start with Fergus, if that's okay, and then move to Pete and then Elliott.
So there's a lot of things that we can do. One thing is helping teachers and school management and administration to realise that a lot of what they can do is actually not very difficult. It's about realising that, like, it's okay for kids to take movement breaks or, you know, be allowed to do things a little bit differently. I think a lot of the time schools have a default expectation of conformity and rigidity, which is disastrous, really, for a lot of students, particularly neurodivergent kids, but not exclusively. It's actually a much bigger problem. And to some extent, being flexible takes resources, but a lot of the time it doesn't really. A lot of the time it's just about listening to kids about what they need and taking them seriously, rather than by default dismissing the things that they say that they need, or, you know, the suffering that they say they experience. Like, no, that's not bad. What are you even talking about? Which I think is still a very common experience for neurodivergent kids at school.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the default mode of, you know, it's like that meme, isn't it? You know, X doubt. You know, every person, every autistic student or even teacher that, you know, has the, you know, puts themselves out there and are brave enough to actually say, I can't handle this, or this is something I can't do. The default response is always disbelief and doubt, or at least it seems to be to me, which is stunning, really, in its ludicrousness, but it is unfortunately extraordinarily common. And as Fergus said, the things that autistic students in particular need more than anything are, generally speaking, tremendously easy to do and also, crucially, incredibly cheap, which tend to be the two things that you would imagine that schools would actually be quite positive about. But because it requires a shift in that rigidity, and of course we're the rigid ones, aren't we? You know, we're the ones that are, you know, overly obsessed with routine and having it to have everything the way that we want it to be. No, they're so wedded to the rigidity of the systems at place and the policies at play that any kind of flexibility goes out the window. So yeah, movement breaks, being able to use a stim toy, being allowed to maybe talk briefly about their special interests with a friendly face at some point, you know, having a place to go that isn't just the library at break time. You know, there are thousands and thousands of tiny little incremental things that you can just put into place in any school environment that would, all that they would require is communication, you know, between staff members and actually telling the children and giving them the awareness that this is possible, and of course, crucially, actually believing that autistic students might be struggling. I think if we somehow manage to sort that out, then things might improve quite rapidly. But for some reason, it's a bit of a challenge.
Thank you. Elliott?
I'm going to start with, I don't work with children, but with my students, who ironically are lecturers learning how to work with their students. It's very meta. I think that it really is just adding to what these two have said, and which is, it's the most important thing, I think, is like a mindset change. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that I can be heard. In that, it seems like you've both said that the default is to assume that if somebody says they need or would like something or does something that people don't expect, that the answer is, you know, that's inherently bad or unacceptable. And the impact, the violence of that, to actually say, well, this is what I would need, and for somebody to respond with, lol, no you don't, and how dare you ask. Like, people never say it like that, but that message has come across to me time and time and time and time again. And I talk quite often about actually believing people, and people so often are like, no, I totally believe them. I just think that they shouldn't really need X, or that they should behave Y. And if you say, well, why? Because that's what's respectful. And it's always built on this strange assumption that X and Y are always respectful, rather than what's really respectful being trying to think about your needs and other people's needs and the impact that you have on others. So I would say that really the big thing is to try and be open to the fact that you might be having impacts you're not aware of, and just being, not blaming yourself at all for that, but being open to thinking about that more. But that does involve moving away from the idea that you can be certain about there being a right way of doing things and a wrong way of doing things. That does not exist. There is not one. You can believe in that certainty because it's safe and comfortable, but it is a delusion. And I think that, therefore, actually, it's about emotionally supporting educators to feel safe and supported in being in this environment that's scary and difficult and might bring up really difficult feelings, where they've been conditioned that it's impossible ever to be wrong.
Yeah, amazing. I wish I had something insightful to add to that, but it was just, yeah, I totally agree. It's incredible. Thank you. I'm going to skip one question just for time, because I think the last two questions are probably more important. So I'm going to start with you, Pete. So what does the neurodiversity paradigm have to offer beyond existing inclusive education? It's a big question, sorry. I've got very broad questions for everyone.
Yeah, I guess, sorry, I was all set for that.
Sorry, I know. I literally, as I said it, I realised.
Yeah, I guess I'm not very good thinking on my feet today.
Do you want one of us to go first?
Yes, please, if you
I don't
could.
mind.
Yes,
Sorry,
please.
Pete, that was
Do you want to? Because I've just spoken, so you might be bored of me.
I suppose theoretically they might be. Okay, sure. So what does the neurodiversity paradigm have to offer beyond existing inclusive education? It's about anticipating difference for me, rather than expecting people to conform to certain ways of learning and being and thinking. Just being aware up front that actually different kids are going to have really different ways of processing things, really different things that they find difficult, things that they find easy. Going into teaching with the understanding that some kids find things much harder than you might expect them to, would make a huge difference. Like, again, it's that thing of being met with incredulity when a kid or an adult learner expresses how difficult they find something or how helpful they would find something. And that's just so unhelpful. It's also about broadening it out a little bit, right? So, you know, inclusive education theoretically includes everyone. But if your model is that there are the normal kids and then there are the special needs kids, then all of the normal kids, the ones who are just assumed to be neurotypical, also have many of their needs just ignored, overlooked completely. Even if they try and tell someone about it, then they're often not taken seriously. Starting from a neurodiversity paradigm, starting from the understanding that different people have different needs and, you know, process things differently, ought to make things better and easier for many of the kids who don't have labelled differences. Because there's all of this neurodiversity within the entire population. One of the reasons that it's so important to not talk about neurodiversity as if there are neurodiverse people and then there are other people, but to acknowledge that the entire population is neurodiverse, is that variation in how people think is actually really important outside of things which are seen as additional support needs or special educational needs or whatever they call them in Wales.
Yeah, I mean, I think what it really challenges is the one-size-fits-all approach to education that just exists across the entire board. You know, there are a few little moments of lip service that exist. You know, you've got foundation papers and higher papers, for example, you know, in England at least. and you've got these tiny little nods towards the fact that not every child is exactly the same, but they are really quite few and far between. And when you come to things like the culmination of the educational process, the whole exam concept of testing, that's where that rigidity and that single mode really kind of becomes overwhelmingly negative, because if the population of students in any given country is incredibly different in the way they process information and the way that they handle tasks and the way that they manage stress and the way that they deal with sensory information, then having these very set rigid exam situations, where there might be a few little adaptations like having a scribe or having a bit of extra time, but they don't really do very much. We are setting up, we are creating a system where the end result is inherently unfair and inherently damaging to probably a very sizable minority, if not actually just creeping into a majority of students. Where any aspect of neurodivergency, whether it's dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, or autism, ADHD, OCD, whatever it might be, is making that incredibly life-important moment more difficult than it should be, in ways that could easily be avoided if anyone actually cared. I'm in quite a bad mood, I think. But there isn't any imperative. There isn't any sense of an imperative at the very top of the tree, when it comes to government policy and things like that, to actually, have the will to make any of these changes. All they tend to do is just tweak what already exists in the hope that maybe we'll shut up and accept it a little bit. But the fact of the matter is that if neurodivergency, if the neurodiverse model is accurate, and I believe very fundamentally that it is, then pretty much everything about education has to change. I'm really sorry. It's bad news, I suppose, to Pearson, AQA, EdXL, etc. It's terribly bad news for everybody, but it's unfortunately going to have to happen, either slowly, incrementally, or in more fell swoops. I'm not trying to start a rebellion or anything, but I think, it's something that I feel very strongly about. I ended up not being able to teach anymore because of the way the education system works, and I love teaching. I still manage to do it a bit, online and with autistic students, but I miss it, and it would be nice to go back one day once the systems are a little bit more adapted to neurodivergent needs.
Thank you. Elliott.
Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out where to start. So I think I'd like to follow on from the idea of the fact that we all have needs that can be different for what will enable us to thrive. Some of those needs are mainstreamed into society and some of them aren't. So it might look like some people have needs and other people don't. It might not be that way. It might just be that a lot of people's are already met. For example, if you need to have eye contact or you strongly prefer to have eye contact with someone when communicating, that's not seen as like, oh my God, you're so weird, why can't you just communicate like a normal person? It's built in as appropriate behavior, air quotes for anyone that's just listening, whereas the need to not make eye contact is seen as a problem. And so you're already putting yourself in the position as somebody that is a problem by asking for that need to be met. But I think that the problem that can come along with the idea of we all have this shared understanding in that we have needs, and that's not to conflict with the points that were made because they are exactly true, is that then people can think, oh, well, I understand what that's like, and so I get to decide what that person really needs. Like, they've said they're overwhelmed. Well, when I'm overwhelmed, I just need a cup of tea, and then I'm fine. Or when I'm tired, I just need to push myself beyond the limits because I've been taught that that's what I have to do to be an acceptable human, and so therefore that's what I'm going to make this other person do because that's in their own best interest. And so I think that the neurodiversity paradigm is very helpful in that the work on double empathy tells us that people are going to be experiencing things in different ways that we can't necessarily imagine or understand. And what that means is actually it takes the pressure off from us of having to know how everyone experiences it, because we just have to believe that there's stuff going on that we don't really get. Like that picture of the dress in 2015, where some people saw it one color, some people saw it another. And it was mind-blowing for so many people, because they're like, but it's objectively this color. No. And so, for me, what that tells us is that in all areas of inclusion in education and beyond, taking that leap of faith and understanding that people will be experiencing something that we don't understand, and therefore taking the pressure off of us to have to decide whether it's valid or gatekeep, is crucial, because it gives us a lens for understanding this difference, which we should expect, without blame. Like, not blaming them for being different. I think so much difficulty comes from people being defensive, because then they feel like they should have known better, and then they have to defend the fact that they were trying really hard. So that's what I think that we can really learn. And to misquote a participant of Catherine Crumpton's one of Catherine Crumpton's participants, I think, was the idea that they really liked speaking to other autistic people, because it felt like there were multiple ways for the conversation to have been like a good conversation, rather than it being that there was one specific way that they were meant to proactively guess. So that's something to keep in mind.
Thank you. I'm going to be mean and ask you the broadest question of all, and ask for short-ish answers for the time, so I'm sorry. But what does truly inclusive education look like for you in an ideal world, I suppose? Go for it, Elliott.
I do have a quick answer to this one. For me, it's not something that can ever actually be attained, because what it means is keeping in mind everyone's needs and trying to make decisions that consider all of those needs as equally legitimate. And therefore, if anyone ever says, this is fully inclusive, it suggests that they might not be aware that there's needs that they might not know about. And for me, the only thing, the thing to start with, I think, the thing that's most important is to try.
So, I mean, truly inclusive education would have to start with flexibility. It's about recognizing the wide variety of needs that people have, and anticipating them. And realistically, that takes time and space. I'm aware that we sort of started this panel talking about how easy and cheap so many of the adaptations that would make life better for autistic kids are. And now we're saying, yeah, but really we ought to just trash everything and start from scratch. But I mean, yeah, we kind of probably should. Because, our entire education system is built around a significant fraction of students failing. That's just an expectation from the beginning. If some people pass exams, other people don't. Otherwise, it doesn't count as a test, right? So this expectation of failure is just inherent to our approach. If we had education as an expectation throughout people's lives, if it wasn't like, oh, you failed your exams at 16, I guess that's you done now, then we wouldn't be failing so many people, and maybe truly inclusive education might be a possibility.
Indeed, yeah. It's a fair point about, it's all really cheap and easy, but let's burn it all down and build something completely afresh. I think, there's two stages, isn't there? And, the sticking plaster for the time being, just to make sure that autistic kids are coping, they're cheap and easy. It's the long, if we're going to, we don't really do long-term solutions in this country anymore, but if we were to do a long-term solution, then yeah, that would be a bit more expensive, but, worth it. But anyway, in terms of, I think it's flexibility too. I think a truly inclusive education is going to be based very heavily on flexibility, and understanding that, like Elliott and Fergus have both said, you can't assume, you can't predict, you can't expect what any given student is going to bring to the table, or what they're going to need, or what they're going to want. And yes, it is impossible to, to cater for everybody all of the time, because life has limitations: time, money, space, etc., etc. But yeah, we can try. We can do our very best, and it does feel at the moment like we're not trying particularly well or particularly hard as a society. So even just a 10% increase in the amount of trying that's going on in education and elsewhere would probably make a really quite significant improvement for the lives of the students. Ultimately, a truly inclusive education would be one where everybody leaves it in a better state than they were when they entered it. That's, I think, that's what education is fundamentally certainly meant to be about. But I've worked with enough traumatized, autistic, neurodivergent people in the past to know that that's sadly not what happens. And a lot of people leave full-time education at the age of 16 or 18 or 21, I suppose, if they go to university. In many ways, a little bit worse off perhaps than when they went in. I was listening to Holly Smale's talk yesterday, and I think she addressed that really quite eloquently. And it's repeated everywhere. It happens again and again and again. So a truly inclusive education system would be one where everyone, I guess I'm going to keep the bar low, where everyone at least came out, not damaged, and able to at least cope a little bit, rather than being maybe, actively traumatized. That would be a truly inclusive education as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Okay, so we have audience questions. We have over 100, so I'm going to try and whip through a couple probably. So I'm just going to ask the question generally, and if any of you feel like you want to answer first, please do. So the first question, it's just jumped to what would you say to students who just want to fit in and don't want to draw attention to themselves?
Fitting in is rubbish.
That's what I'd hoped you'd say.
I think for me, that's a very understandable way to feel, and I think there's two elements of that, only one of which I'm going to mention properly. So one is, of course, I would want to do what I could to help that person feel okay being themselves. But taking that to the side, I think that's why approaches like Universal Design for Learning, which are about trying to mainstream and proactively design things in a way that do allow space for flexibility, choice, and agency, is the way to go, because it stops putting the burden on the marginalized person to A, out themselves, and B, risk being treated really badly for having to declare themselves. And I know that that's separate from the whole being yourself thing, but given that we're short on time, that's my answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you never know the individual circumstances for any student, and I speak as somebody who very much just wanted to keep my head down and survive, because you just don't know what kind of challenges there might be in the background, what kind of difficulties there might be going on elsewhere. So yeah, I've got a lot of compassion for that point of view. It's very, very difficult being different in the schooling system. I mean, it's very difficult being different in life. But I think, yeah, it would be good to have systems in place where somebody at least felt safer to be able to be themselves truly. Maybe dropping the mask is a little too strong. We talk too blasely, I think, too often about dropping the autistic mask. I think it's much harder than a lot of people, a lot of neurotypical people especially, kind of seem to think. But even a small amount of mask droppage, I think, can be very helpful and very it reduces that drain that the mask has. But yeah, I think, yeah, it's great if we can be open, but I've got a lot of sympathy for anyone that just wants to keep their head down and just get through, and make it to year 11, year 13, or whatever it might be in one piece.
It's just struck me that this might be a question from somebody who is or knows somebody who is in that situation themselves. And if that's the case, I don't have a great, perfect answer. But what I would say is, if there's a way in a way that the person in question would feel comfortable and safe and happy with, helping them find maybe like-minded people in activities outside of school or different places. There's various ways of going about that, and there are charities that can help in different locations. But I think that for me, most of the people that I've really clicked with, not all, have been people that I've met outside my primary context. And that's what's been great about adulthood, has been meeting a lot of people. Like these two people I know from Twitter, a lot of people here I know from Twitter, which is something I just didn't have the capabilities or the technology to do at school. So that's something that, if it is a practical, real question, there.
I'm going all over the place with these questions. So the Department of Education maintains that school is the best place for children and young people. To what extent does the panel believe this to be true for autistic pupils?
I think that for me, the answer I would say is that saying that any place is the best place unilaterally for everyone is overly simplistic and suggests that individual context is irrelevant. And I am aware of lots of situations where school has been not the best place for people. I also think school is not a monolith, it's not one thing. Like for some schools, that will be a really supportive place. For some people, it's about compatibility. I imagine that based on what you've said, you probably have a lot to say about this, so I will be quiet and let the people that actually work in schools contribute.
I mean, schools are often terrible places for a lot of students. That's the truth of the matter. You know, I work with a lot of kids who have left schools. You know, I work at schools which accept a lot of kids who have been through terrible, terrible experiences at other schools. And for some of them, the schools that I work at are just the thing, and they thrive, and it's beautiful. For others, those schools don't work either. And maybe there's a school out there for them somewhere. But the assumption that school is the place where kids should be is, I think, just terribly harmful, and really fails to appreciate both how traumatic schools can be and how good other environments can be. You know, there's so much that you can learn outside of school, and the assumption that learning only happens at school is just completely unfounded.
Yeah, I think this kind of general antipathy, that's the word, thank you. Yeah, the general antipathy towards home education, for example, just as an alternative that's seen, is incredibly damaging, because, yes, obviously, you know, home education needs to be, you know, kept an eye on, and, you know, you want to make sure that nobody is slipping through nets or, you know, potentially suffering, you know, in those circumstances. But that doesn't mean that home education as a whole should be just kind of thrown out, you know, or seen as just bad. I mean, for some students, that may well be the very best situation they could find themselves in. But unfortunately, it's often, you know, viewed as being, you know, massively inferior to the schooling system, even though, I mean, I've said it many, many times, Fergus has just said it, I mean, I truly believe that the education system as it exists and that schools generally are tremendously hostile spaces for a lot of neurodivergent students. So the idea of there being options, and the idea of there being options that are viewed positively and with sympathy and with, ideally with support from government, from policy, from local government, I think would improve outcomes considerably, because then there will be, it's flexibility again, then there will be flexibility for students who need whatever it might be that they need to get perhaps more of what they need, rather than being all pushed into the same situation because that's all that we can offer.
Thank you. Going in another direction again. Is there a lack of acknowledgement of the benefits of learning and being outdoors for neurodivergent young people and teachers?
Yeah. Most schools don't have sufficient outdoor space, and most kids don't get sufficient outdoor time. I think, credit to the Scottish Government, there has been a significant push for quite a few years now to get more kids learning outside. And I think that's great, but that's largely restricted to primary schools, as I understand it. Yeah, I mean, time outdoors and connecting with nature is a whole topic of its own, which I'll stop there because otherwise we'll go on.
I mean, I don't specialise in this area the way that you do, apart from a 5-month stint teaching outdoor education on top of a mountain. But what I would say is, in addition to that, it's important, again, I'm not saying you're saying this at all, I'm just saying it's important not to interpret that as meaning that now we do still have an idea of what's best for everyone, and it's nature, and now we can enforce that and tell anyone that they, for whatever reason, can't or don't want to, or it would be harmful to engage in that really it's their own fault that they're not experiencing life very well. And I know that that sounds quite harsh, but there are so many kind of microaggressions that are done in that way, and it all comes from that colonial patriarchal idea that we can say what's best, which is a very easy way of controlling people.
Yeah, I must admit, I mean, I come from a position here where if somebody had said to me on a, you know, I don't know, in the summer term or whatever, oh, next year, by the way, you're going to be teaching English outside, I probably would have started crying. Just, you know, I love the outdoors. I'm a huge fan of, you know, I walk a lot. I like taking it in. I find the only relaxation I ever really managed to achieve is through looking at trees for some reason. But yeah, I would struggle, and I think as a student as well, I would have struggled with the uprooting. I mean, I hated PE lessons, not just because it was involved, you know, balls being thrown around and, you know, people shouting at you and you're not really knowing what the rules are, but also because it involved leaving the classroom, which at least I understood, and I got the classroom, I could figure that out, you know, I managed to deal with the routine of that. I found that going outside to be very, very, you know, uprooting and quite frightening. You know, too different, too big. So yeah, I think, you know, it's a good idea, and there's a core there which I think is useful. But yeah, as always, flexibility. You know, and if a student might not want to do that. You know, a student might not want to go and make mud pies in the forest because sensory issues, and I don't know about you, but I don't like getting mud on my fingers at all. A mud pie for me is not a fun pie. So yeah, I think, you know, flexibility and just making sure that, yes, those that benefit from it, great. If they may not, then don't force it.
Thank you. I'm going to have one question about higher education specifically, because I think this is really important, probably starting with you, Elliott, if that's okay. Are there any ways to challenge disability advisors in higher education saying students are adults and not offering support to fill in forms, etc., that would then lead on to further support?
You know what, students are adults, and that's great, and I think that that's exactly the approach that we should take, and it's exactly the approach that I am going to be taking in a chapter I should be writing right now about compassion, which is that if students are adults, then in a lot of cases, they are able to, and in all cases should be supported to, make their own decisions about what they need. Mm-hmm. And if what they need is support filling in forms, then that is in fact what they need. I just love this idea. They're grown up, so I'm going to tell them that they can't make decisions about their own life. Incredible flex. I mean, I understand. I know. I'm aware that it wouldn't have been said like that. But for me, that's really the core of it all. Like, don't steal this idea. I'm about to write it down in this chapter. But I think I was going to call it self-regulation, but Sonny and I were talking yesterday. They said rewilding. I liked that. And what I'm saying is, we're talking a lot in HE, in higher education, about the idea that students should be independent, and how on earth can we support them to become independent learners, and they all just want to be spoon-fed. And yet, we also say that their own decisions and needs are invalid, and that the choices they make around that are just examples of poor judgment. So my approach is that if we can take a shift to thinking about, because we can't possibly know what they all need, but we can help students build the skills to identify their own needs and create an environment where it is safe for them to express those needs without repercussion. And if we do that, then, just remember the question, good, it was like, wait a minute. If we do that, and then we believe those needs are accurate, then I think that everything would be a lot better. So, I mean, I'm not saying that to somebody who doesn't agree with that is necessarily going to be the solution. But I think if it were me, I might passive-aggressively pose the question. It's interesting, they are adults, so it seems like they've got a fairly good understanding of themselves and that this is what would help them. But honestly, I feel like that approach, not the approach that was described in the question all comes down to lol, disabled people are all on the take and just chancers. And there's so much to unpack there, so good luck.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes left. I have one question I'd really like to ask, if that's okay. So, it takes all kinds of minds, but where are the non-verbal minds? Are we missing a section of the community and one which experiences disproportionate disadvantage?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's certainly not an easy one. I think one thing to say is that people who don't communicate through speech have a lot in common with those of us who do. So, like, we have always missed the needs of people who don't speak. And they've always been misunderstood and treated badly. But understanding that many of their experiences are going to have a good deal in common with the experiences of people who, are also autistic, if we're talking about autistic people, can help people to get a great deal of insight into those people. But we also, we need to be learning from them directly as much as we can as well.
Yeah, yes, we do. Non-speaking autistic people have a whole world and a whole wealth of understanding and experiences that, yes, remain even now unheard, unread, unacknowledged, which is unhelpful. It really is, and it's not as if there isn't that information out there, but it's still not out there in the mainstream. The blogs, the Twitter accounts, and so on and so forth. They're not the ones that typically end up getting quoted or people getting sent to or getting recommended. Even now still, and it's a huge problem because there is a wealth there that we're all missing out on. I think the more that we continue to either ignore or just accidentally ignore just because we just don't happen to happen across it. So yeah, anything that can be done to and I'm guilty of this myself. I mean, I don't use Twitter very much anymore, but to amplify and to get that information out there is always going to benefit all, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes lecturers will say, okay, but how can I force everyone to participate verbally in X situation? And I think the answer is more, how can we create an environment where if people would like to communicate, there will be a way for them to do so in a way that feels safe for them. And so creating spaces for non-verbal communication and taking cues from the people who are non-verbal, who specialize in this and who share information about this is important. And it's important, with 15 seconds left, to note that sometimes we use proficiency with words, verbally or written, as a proxy for intelligence and moral fiber and character, and that is because of power, not because of, and not that intelligence should in any way be a way of marking value either. So it's just important to notice that those things are happening and to try and challenge that.
Great, we went 10 seconds over, so thank you so much to our speakers. It was incredible. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.